Hi guys, I thought it was time for another single book review video because last week I read what I think might be the best book that I've read so far this year. Its author is reasonably well known, but the book itself is not one of her most famous works, which surprised me because it is so well done and so touching. The book is The Lie by the late Helen Dunmore. This is a very intimate look at the effects that the trench warfare of the First World War has had on the psyche of one young man, one English soldier. It is a very quiet, very character-driven novel. There's not much of a plot at all, and what plot there is takes place in the past, so we know the outcome of it already. But because we, the readers, spend the whole of this short novel in the mind of this traumatized protagonist and first-person narrator, it is a very intense reading experience nonetheless. So the protagonist, Daniel Brenwell, is dismissed from service after the end of the First World War. He has served in the trenches in France and is now released back into the wild, so to speak, and he comes back to his hometown in Cornwall, only he has nothing and no one back there. He has lost the most important relationship of his life in the war. He suffers from PTSD and survivor's guilt. His mother has died in his absence. They were bitterly poor and she has left him nothing, and he has no place left to stay. He has no connections, no social safety net to catch him. He gets taken in by an elderly woman who lives by the sea and who allows him to build a lean-to on her patch of land. She's frail and sick, and so she's happy to have somebody to collect her hen's eggs and to milk her goat for her. And Daniel considers himself lucky because so many of his comrades have ended up as little more than beggars on the streets of London. But when this elderly landlady dies, just days after Daniel arrives, Daniel is afraid that he will get evicted from the land, so he keeps her death a secret. He buries her behind her cottage, which is actually according to her wishes, and he moves into the house and takes possession of the land and the goat and the hens. On a rare foray into town, he runs into an old friend of his and tentatively begins to rekindle his friendship with her. She and her brother grew up with Daniel, even though they are from a very different social background. They come from a wealthy family, and Daniel's mother used to clean their house for them. And she also acted as a nanny for them for some time, so Daniel and the two siblings became very close, especially Daniel and the boy Frederick. And all through their youth, even when they weren't physically close because Frederick went to boarding school, they still kept a very close friendship, which seemed to border on codependence sometimes, until the war put an end to it when it killed Frederick. Frederick's younger sister Felicia is now a widow with a toddler whose father also died in the war, and she lives alone in the big house. Daniel tries to reconnect with her and with their shared past, for comfort, of course, but in the end it seems to only throw him deeper into despair and into ruminations about their childhood and adolescence, and most of all, about that one fateful day on which Frederick was killed in the trenches. Because the sad reality is that Daniel never really came home from the war. Half the time his mind is still in the trenches and keeps reliving that one horrible day over and over again. But then, of course, after a while, the townsfolk start to ask questions about the whereabouts of the old lady, and Daniel's whole existence, such as it is, comes under threat once again. On the surface level, this is the lie of the title, Daniel's deceit, when he concealed the death of the old lady. But there are several more ways in which the lie can be interpreted. There is, of course, this one big lie, the one about the war and the reason why the soldiers were sent into the trenches. The lie that it was a noble cause and that it was the war to end all wars. There's an epitaph in the front of the book, which is that one short poem by Kipling, which reads, "If any question why we died, tell them because our fathers lied." This accusation is always there in the background, but it is not something that Daniel ever thinks about, let alone talks about. On the contrary, he never goes anywhere near commenting on the war or even just thinking about the war in general. It never goes beyond the immediate experience. And I think that that's very realistic. Because criticism of the war endeavor wasn't very widespread at that point, and anyway, not usually voiced by the common soldiers. And B, the protagonist and narrator is a boy who was very introverted and self-sufficient in the first place, but whom his PTSD in conjunction with his social isolation have confined even more to his own horrifying inner world, where there is no room for commentary on history and society. But of course, outside of the narrative's inner logic, this book is, of course, a commentary on the war and on some of the ways that the people were let down. But in the story itself, there are more lies. Lies that Daniel tells himself or that he told himself in the past, lies that he's lived or that he thinks he's lived, and lies that he is telling every day, which in his mind all amount to one big lie which he is telling, or which he thinks he is telling, because Daniel's interpretation of events and those of the reader might not always be on the same page. It's hard to talk about this without being suggestive in a spoilery way. It's all very complicated psychologically. And I don't want to spoil anything because it is so heartbreaking at the end when you realize the whole extent of it. Helen Dunmore reveals this whole sorry mess slowly with a very clever narrative structure. So I have to admit, when I first opened the book, my heart sank when I realized that it is written in the first person present tense. The problem with present tense narration in the first person is that it ignores the fact that first person narration always requires a frame story. Even if that frame story isn't verbally realized, it has to be there in the background because it is the background. It is the position from which the narrator narrates the story. So what is that supposed to be in the present tense if it isn't stylized as a diary or something of the kind? Is the reader to just assume that he is floating in a bubble beside the narrator's head while the narrator is acting out the story? That doesn't make sense either, because in that case the reader would just be able to observe what is happening and wouldn't need the narrator to tell him or her what is happening. So no, obviously this is not what the reader is supposed to imagine. The truth is that first-person narration in the present tense just pretends that this whole narrative level can just be dispensed of. And obviously, in the case at hand, Helen Dunmore had the problem that she wanted to write first-person narration in order to be able to dive deeply into her protagonist's mind. Yet first-person narration isn't really compatible with where she wanted to take the plot. Usually stuff like that puts me off. It's just bad craft and cheating. But in this case, I was able to make an exception because the rest of it is just so well crafted. So we have three different timelines here. We have the now, in which Daniel has come back to Cornwall, and this present-day narrative is interspersed with flashbacks to Daniel's childhood and adolescence, or rather to the story of his relationship with Frederick right up until the day Frederick died. And these sequences Daniel tells in the past tense. Yet there is also a second now, which is also told in the present tense, although from the reader's perspective it is very much in the past. And that is the day that Frederick died and the events of that day. For Daniel, this is very much still the now, and half the time his mind is still in the trenches and he keeps reliving this fateful day again and again. And this mixture of timelines builds up to one big emotional climax at the end, which isn't any less heartbreaking for the fact that you could see it coming from the beginning. And anyway, the whole scope of the heartbreak only becomes apparent at the very end anyway, when the timelines converge and you fully realize how and why Daniel has selected the memories about his relationship with Frederick that he selected to tell you. And when you realize how current feelings influence how he remembers those scenes, and how those scenes in turn inform his current feelings. I thought that apart from the first person present tense problem, this was a very well crafted little gem of a story. I recommend it to anybody who likes quiet character studies with a tragic ending. However, this has also led me down a rabbit hole of complicated and conflicting thoughts about reading war novels. I mean to make a video, a kind of a chatty video on this subject in the next few days. In the meantime, I hope I have encouraged you to look into The Lie by Helen Dunmore, or maybe even pick it up. Happy reading! See you soon!